The lantern light trembled as it moved across the desk, casting long shadows over the plantation office walls. Dust hung in the air, thick with age and humidity, clinging to ledgers that had not been questioned in decades. Cotton yields, sugar barrels, livestock losses, numbers that defined profit and power, filled most of the pages. But the overseer's hand stopped at one section he was never meant to linger on, a column kept apart from the rest, a column without headings, just dates, names of enslaved women, and notes written smaller than the others, as if shrinking the words might lessen their meaning. Blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin, over and over again. Babies born on different plantations, in different parishes, to mothers who shared nothing in common except their bondage. And yet the children looked the same. Too white, too identical, too impossible to be chance. Whispers followed the river faster than boats ever could. From St. James to Ascension, from one sugar estate to the next, the same story surfaced in hushed voices. Midwives spoke with fear in their eyes. House servants overheard conversations meant to stay behind closed doors. Traders noticed the pattern and said nothing because patterns were dangerous. These were not isolated births. This was repetition, precision, a signature written not in ink, but in flesh and bone. Someone was moving freely through these plantations. Someone protected by status, by silence, by law. Someone leaving behind children who should not exist. And hidden inside that ledger, beneath polite bookkeeping and calculated cruelty, was the beginning of a truth no one wanted to face. One father, 7 years, 13 children, and a truth so cruel, it was perfectly legal. Before we go any further into this story, let me say this clearly. You're listening to Noctivox Dark Stories, a channel dedicated to uncovering the parts of history that were buried on purpose, the stories that don't live in textbooks, the ones whispered, denied, or erased because they made powerful people uncomfortable. If stories like this matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And I want to hear from you while you're listening. Drop a comment below and tell me what state or city you're listening from. These stories stretch across places and generations, and I want to know where you're joining from tonight. What you're about to hear unfolded between 1837 and 1844 along the Mississippi River in Louisiana's sugar country. 7 years, 13 births, and a mystery that everyone noticed, but no one was allowed to name. In the late 1830s, Louisiana was a land of sharp contrasts, stitched together by the Mississippi River. New Orleans glittered with wealth, culture, and excess. Opera houses, chandeliers imported from Europe, fine dining that rivaled Paris itself. Ships crowded the docks, unloading sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. To outsiders it looked like prosperity, civilization, progress. But just beyond the gaslit streets and grand balconies, another world existed, one built on exhaustion, pain, and calculated cruelty. North of the city, the sugar parishes ruled everything. St. James, St. John the Baptist, Ascension. Here, sugar plantations lined the river so closely that one property blurred into the next. No wide-open isolation like cotton fields farther inland. These estates sat shoulder to shoulder, separated only by tree lines, bayous, or fences that meant nothing to sound or rumor. What happened on one plantation was known on 3 others by sunrise. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did silence. Sugar was different from cotton. More profitable, more dangerous, more unforgiving. The harvest depended on grinding season, a narrow window between October and December when cane had to be cut, crushed, boiled, and packed before frost ruined everything. During those months, plantations became factories that never slept. Enslaved people worked 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours a day. Exhaustion wasn't a side effect, it was the system. Mistakes meant injury. Injury meant death, and death was written off as loss of property. The machinery didn't forgive. Grinding rollers caught arms, hair, entire bodies. Boiling vats splashed liquid hot enough to strip flesh to bone. People collapsed where they stood, only to be replaced without pause. Plantation owners knew the mortality rates were the highest in the South, and they accepted it. It was cheaper to work people until they broke and buy replacements than to slow production. This constant pressure created a world where fear was normal and silence was survival. And yet, despite the brutality, information traveled fast. The river was a highway. Steamboats carried goods, letters, visitors, and gossip up and down its length. Enslaved people had families on neighboring plantations. Traders stopped at multiple landings. House servants overheard conversations meant to stay private. A birth, a death, a punishment. Nothing stayed secret for long. When something strange happened, everyone knew. That closeness is what turned isolated shock into shared dread. Because when the first unusual baby was born, it wasn't dismissed. And when another appeared miles away, people remembered the first. By the third and fourth, it was no longer coincidence. It was pattern. In a world trained to ignore suffering, repetition demanded attention. And along the Mississippi River, surrounded by wealth built on bondage, the conditions were perfect for something terrible to hide in plain sight. The first birth happened at Bellamont Plantation in March of 1837, just before dawn, when the air was still cool and the quarters were quiet. Bellamont was a mid-sized sugar operation owned by the Duchamp family, old Creole money with deep roots in the region. Behind the elegant main house and the busy sugar works sat 2 rows of cabins where the enslaved lived, crowded together, stripped of privacy, bound by routine and survival. It was here, on a dirt floor lit by a single oil lamp, that something began which no ledger could truly contain. The mother was a woman named Marie. She was 23 years old, dark-skinned, strong, and born on Bellamont itself. She had never known freedom, never known another home. When she was 12, she watched her own mother die in the sugar house, caught in the grinding mill, while Marie stood frozen only steps away. After that day, Marie became quiet. She worked, she obeyed, she survived. She had been paired by the overseer with a field hand named Thomas, a practical arrangement meant to produce more labor for the plantation. Their first child, a boy named Jack, looked exactly as expected: dark skin, dark eyes, tightly coiled hair. The midwife was Josephine, an elderly enslaved woman who had delivered more than 200 babies in her lifetime. She had been born before the Haitian Revolution, sold into Louisiana, and had seen everything childbirth could offer: stillbirths, fevers, mothers who bled out on cabin floors. Josephine had learned not to react, not to hope, not to show fear. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and lifted her toward the lamplight, something broke through that hard-earned calm. The baby's skin was pale, not light, pale. Her hair was almost white, fine and blonde, already catching the glow of the lamp. When her eyes opened, they were unmistakably blue. Not grey, not hazel. Blue like winter sky. Josephine felt her stomach tighten with fear. This was not distant ancestry surfacing. This was not a slight variation. This child looked completely European, as though she belonged to an entirely different world. Marie said nothing at first. She stared at her daughter, hands shaking, tears sliding silently down her face. When Josephine asked, softly, whether the child looked like anyone she knew, Marie did not answer. Her silence carried more truth than words ever could. She wrapped the baby close to her chest and rocked gently, grief and resignation written across her face. When Thomas arrived, exhaustion still clinging to him from the night shift, he stopped cold in the doorway. He looked once, then again. "That's not mine," he said flatly. Marie whispered that it was, that she did not understand, that she had been with no one else. But Thomas wouldn't hear it. He turned and walked away, refusing to look at the child again. By midday, everyone on Bellamont knew. People crowded into the cabin, whispering, staring, crossing themselves. Some spoke of curses, others of punishment. A few said nothing at all, their faces dark with understanding they dared not voice. By evening, the story had already reached neighboring plantations, carried along the river by invisible networks no overseer could fully control. Vincent Heber, the overseer, was the first white man to confront the situation formally. He was meticulous, educated, and deeply uneasy. He questioned Marie, then Thomas, then others who shared the cabin. No one could explain the impossible. When Hebert reported the birth to Monsieur Duchamp, the order was immediate and firm. Record the child. Note the unusual appearance. But list Thomas as the father. No discussion, no deviation. That night, Hebert opened a different book. his personal journal, kept separate from the plantation records. There he wrote what he could not officially acknowledge: the date, the child's appearance, Marie's silence, Thomas's rejection. He named the baby Claire, and as he closed the journal, Herbert had no way of knowing this would be the first entry in a record that would haunt him for the next 7 years. 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. This time at Riverside Plantation, 6 miles upriver from Bellemont, in the late spring of 1838. Riverside was larger, wealthier, and far more feared. Its owner, Etienne Broussard, believed absolute violence was the only way to maintain order. His overseer, Gideon Frost, enforced that belief with a whip always within reach. Fear, not discipline, was the foundation of Riverside's control. The mother was Deline, only 20 years old, quiet and efficient, chosen to work in the main house because she had mastered invisibility. She had been sold away from her family at 15 and never saw them again. Like Marie, she had been paired with a man, Samuel, a strong field hand she barely knew. Their connection was practical, not loving, a survival arrangement imposed from above. When Deline gave birth after a long, exhausting labor, the midwife cleaned the baby and froze. The child was a boy, pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, the same impossible features. Deline stared at her son in disbelief, whispering that it could not be real. She swore, again and again, that Samuel was the father, that she had been with no one else. Her voice broke as she said it, but it never changed. Samuel's reaction mirrored Thomas's. One look was enough. He accused Deline of betrayal, refused to accept the child, and demanded reassignment to another crew. The fragile bond forced upon them shattered instantly. What little stability existed was gone. When Gideon Frost arrived, there was no patience, no curiosity, only rage. He questioned Deline for hours, his voice sharp, his threats explicit. He demanded names she did not have, explanations she could not give. Deline held to the same answer until exhaustion took her voice. She had nothing else to offer. Frost reported the birth to Broussard with anger and defensiveness, already anticipating blame. Broussard's response was swift and cold. The birth was to be recorded with Samuel listed as the father. No further discussion, no inquiry, no acknowledgement of the obvious. To admit the truth would be to admit loss of control, and that was unacceptable. The ledger would say one thing, reality would say another, and reality would be ignored. When news of the birth reached Bellemont, Vincent Herbert felt something shift inside him. 2 plantations, 2 women, 2 children with identical features. Both mothers had been working in or near the main house. Both swore they had been with no one else. This was no longer an anomaly. It was repetition, precision. Herbert opened his journal and made a second entry. He wrote Deline's name beside Marie's, Riverside beside Bellemont. He added dates, locations, details others wanted erased. And as he stared at the pages, a thought settled in with chilling certainty. This wasn't chance. This wasn't rumor. This was design. Over the next 2 years, the impossible stopped being rare and became routine. Another birth appeared in November of 1838 at Oakmont Plantation, a respected estate known for hosting social gatherings and dinners for neighboring planters. The mother was Isabel, a young woman assigned as a cook's assistant in the main house. She insisted, just like the others, that her partner Gabriel was the only man she had known. But the baby girl she delivered had the same pale skin, the same blonde hair, the same blue eyes that no one could explain. Gabriel refused the child and left the cabin within days. The whispers began before the child was even named. Only months later, in March of 1839, St. Clair Plantation joined the pattern. The mother, Therese, had been brought into the main house temporarily to help serve guests during a large dinner. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Her son was born with the now familiar features, European in every visible way. Her partner, Antoine, refused to claim the child, accusing her of betrayal she could not defend herself against. No investigation followed. The ledger recorded a lie and moved on. By September of that same year, Magnolia Grove became impossible to ignore. Pauline, a laundry worker, had been called up to assist with cleaning during a period when regular house servants were overwhelmed. Her daughter was born blonde and blue-eyed, unmistakable in appearance. Pauline's partner, Louis, abandoned her immediately. By then, even those who tried to deny the truth felt unease settle into their bones. Too many births, too many similarities, too many excuses repeated word for word. Vincent Hebert began to work methodically. He stopped asking if and started asking when. He noted exact dates of conception, compared them against plantation logs, guest visits, and house assignments. He marked which women had worked inside the main houses, which had been called up temporarily, which had been near authority and access. Then he drew a map: Bellamont, Riverside, Oakmont, St. Clair, Magnolia Grove, all aligned along the Mississippi River, all within 15 miles. The pattern was undeniable. Every birth carried the same signature. Every mother had proximity. Every denial sounded the same. This was not rumor spreading panic. This was repetition with precision, something planned, something controlled. And once Hebert saw it laid out in ink and distance, he understood the most terrifying truth of all. Whatever was happening could happen again, and again. As the map filled with names and dates, one detail kept resurfacing in the margins of Vincent Hebert's notes, not written boldly, never listed as a cause, just present again and again like a shadow that refused to separate itself from the pattern: Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was 42 years old, unmarried and widely respected across the parishes. Born to a French father and a Creole mother, educated in Paris, refined in speech and manner, he dressed carefully, spoke softly, and carried himself with absolute confidence. Plantation owners trusted him because he was discreet. He asked no questions that threatened reputations. He spoke of illness, recovery, and science, not scandal. That trust gave him something few men possessed: unrestricted access. Levine moved freely between plantations. He stayed overnight as a guest, ate meals with families, walked unchallenged through main houses and slave quarters alike. He treated planters' wives, children, and valuable enslaved workers whose health protected profits. When Levine arrived, doors opened. When he left, nothing was supposed to follow him. But when Hebert overlaid Levine's visits with the births, the alignment was exact. At Bellamont, Levine had attended a social gathering 3 months before Marie conceived. At Riverside, he treated Madame Broussard for illness shortly before Deline's pregnancy began. At Oakmont, he delivered the planter's child weeks before Isabel conceived. At St. Clair, he examined an injured worker during the same window. At Magnolia Grove, he stayed overnight after a dinner party. Always present, always close, always timed perfectly. The realization made Hebert physically ill. This was not coincidence. It was opportunity used repeatedly. And once the name took shape, Hebert knew the truth might already be known by the women themselves. He tried to ask them, quietly, carefully. Marie listened and said nothing. Her face closed, her eyes lowered. "Thomas is the father," she repeated, reciting the record instead of the truth. Deline reacted the same way. Isabel, Therese, Pauline, different plantations, same response. Silence, wrapped in survival. Hebert understood why. These women had no protection, no legal standing, no voice that would be believed over a respected white physician. Speaking meant punishment. Speaking meant separation from their children. Silence was not denial, it was armor. And as Hebert walked away from each conversation, one truth became impossible to escape. The women knew. They had always known. And the system ensured they could never say it out loud. By the summer of 1840, Vincent Hebert knew he could not carry the knowledge alone any longer. What he held was bigger than plantation gossip, bigger than private journals and quiet maps. It was a pattern that crossed properties, families, and parishes. And if it meant anything at all, it meant the law had to see it. So Hebert chose the only man he believed might listen: Judge Armand Thibault of St. James Parish. Thibault was 60 years old, seasoned, respected, and known for his careful sense of fairness within the limits of the system. His office smelled of ink, old paper, and heat trapped by thick walls. Hebert laid everything out slowly: the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, the identical features of the children, the timing of Dr. Levine's visits. He showed the judge the map, the timeline, the repetition that could not be explained away. Thibault listened without interruption, his expression tightening with every detail. When Hebert finished, the judge sat back in silence. Finally, he spoke the question that cut straight to the heart of it. "Do you have testimony?" Hebert shook his head. The women would not speak, could not speak. Thibault nodded slowly, already seeing the wall ahead. Without testimony, there was no case. And even with testimony, the judge knew the truth. Enslaved women had no legal standing. Their words could not outweigh those of a white man, especially one as respected as Dr. Levine. Still, Thibault agreed to make inquiries. Quiet ones. Discreet ones. He spoke privately with several plantation owners, careful to avoid accusation, careful to frame his questions as concern rather than challenge. The responses were immediate and defensive. They denied any wrongdoing, called the births anomalies, invoked distant ancestry, and beneath every explanation was the same fear, not of injustice, but of scandal. To acknowledge the truth would mean admitting loss of control. It would mean admitting that someone had violated enslaved women without consequence. Worse, it would threaten property values and social standing. Reputation mattered more than evidence. Stability mattered more than truth. One owner after another insisted the matter be dropped before it caused unnecessary disturbance. Within weeks, the investigation ended without ever officially beginning. Thibault sent word to Hebert that there was insufficient evidence to proceed. No law had been clearly broken. No charges could be brought. The matter was closed, quietly, cleanly, officially. But outside the courthouse, nothing stopped. Another birth followed. Then another. The children kept coming. The law had turned away. And whatever was happening along the river understood that it could continue. After the seventh birth, fear stopped being quiet. It settled into the quarters like a sickness that never broke. Women began watching the main houses differently, measuring distance, timing footsteps, inventing excuses before orders were even given. When overseers called for extra hands, laundry, cleaning, serving, some women claimed illness. Others moved slowly, deliberately incompetent, hoping to be sent back to the fields. A few refused outright, knowing exactly what that refusal would cost them. The response was immediate and brutal. Overseers interpreted resistance as defiance, not fear. Whips came out. Rations were reduced. Women were beaten for disobedience, accused of laziness, punished for imagined insolence. But the punishments did not break the pattern. If anything, they hardened it. Women would rather endure pain than risk another child born with a face that told a story no one was allowed to tell. This fear spread beyond individual plantations. Mothers warned daughters in whispers late at night. Older women coached younger ones on how to disappear during house assignments, how to feign weakness, how to stay close to groups. Survival tactics passed quietly from mouth to ear. These were not rebellions written in blood or fire. They were refusals written in absence. As resistance grew, tension followed. Productivity slipped. Housework fell behind. Laundry piled up. Meals were delayed. Overseers blamed enslaved workers. Plantation owners blamed overseers. The order they depended on began to crack at the edges. And in that instability, the truth found space to move. Traders noticed first. They traveled constantly, stopping at multiple landings along the Mississippi, hearing the same whispers repeated in different voices. Blonde babies, blue eyes. Same story, different plantation. Overseers compared notes quietly, usually late at night, careful who was listening. What began as rumor hardened into shared certainty. By the summer of 1842, the story no longer belonged to the quarters alone. It reached riverboats, taverns, parish offices, not spoken openly, not written down, but known. Plantation owners tried to smother it, calling it dangerous gossip, insisting it threatened stability. But stories like this do not disappear once spoken. They spread faster when denied. Fear had escaped the cabins and entered the region itself. And once that happened, silence was no longer guaranteed. In September of 1842, the whispers reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. And instead of denying them, instead of fleeing or hiding, he did something no one expected. He invited the men to his house. Formal invitations, politely worded, requesting the presence of plantation owners from the affected estates, Judge Armand Thibault, and, most unsettling of all, Vincent Hebert. The message was simple. There had been questions, and Levine wished to address them directly. The night of the meeting, Levine greeted each man personally at the door, calm, impeccably dressed, his pale blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes steady and untroubled. He poured brandy, offered cigars, spoke easily, as though hosting a social gathering rather than standing at the center of a growing scandal. When all were seated, he stood before them, glass in hand, and spoke without hesitation. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am the father of those children. All of them." The room erupted, shouts, chairs scraping, accusations hurled without structure. Judge Thibault struggled to restore order. Levine waited patiently, sipping his drink, watching the chaos with detached interest. When silence finally returned, he continued as though explaining a medical case. He called it an experiment, a scientific inquiry into heredity. He spoke of selective breeding, of dominant traits, of racial characteristics as variables rather than identities. He described the women as available subjects and the children as results. Not once did he use the word person. Not once did he acknowledge consent. When Vincent Hebert finally spoke the word rape, Levine did not flinch. He corrected him calmly. Rape, he said, was a crime committed against persons, and under Louisiana law, enslaved women were not persons. They were property. Property could not be violated. It could only be used. The logic was monstrous and perfectly legal. The men in the room understood the truth immediately. Levine had broken no statute. The law they relied on to protect their wealth and authority protected him too. To challenge him would be to challenge the foundation of their own power. So they did not argue the law. They argued reputation. Levine was ordered to leave the parish, not as punishment, not as justice, but as containment. He agreed easily, already prepared. His work, he said, was complete. Texas offered new opportunities, fewer eyes, more freedom. Within weeks, he was gone. No charges were filed, no records made. The children remained, the mothers remained, and the system moved on, unchanged, unchallenged, intact. When Levine disappeared into the frontier, the damage did not leave with him. 13 children remained behind, growing up in the quarters with faces that marked them as different from the moment they could walk. Blonde hair that caught the sun, blue eyes that drew stares, skin that burned easily under Louisiana heat. They were living evidence of something no one wanted acknowledged. As they grew older, that difference became danger. Some were sold for their appearance, pushed into house service or worse, valued not as people but as curiosities. Their mothers carried a quieter burden, raising children who were constant reminders of nights they could never speak about. Some loved their children fiercely despite the pain. Others withdrew, unable to separate the child from the violation that created them. Families fractured, partners left. Silence settled in and stayed. Vincent Hebert stayed at Bellamont for several more years, but he was never the same. He continued his work, filled his ledgers, followed orders, but he kept his private journals locked away. Pages filled with dates, names, maps, patterns the law refused to see. After the Civil War, after slavery collapsed under its own cruelty, Hebert donated those journals to a historical society. In his final note, he wrote that they documented a crime that had never been a crime, suffering that had never been recognized. He kept them because someday he believed the truth would matter. And that is the real ending of this story. Because the greatest horror was not just one man who called violence science, it was the system that made him untouchable, a legal structure that denied personhood, denied consent, denied justice, and then called itself orderly. If this story unsettled you, it should. And it raises a question worth asking. How many other truths were buried simply because the law decided they did not matter? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts below. Subscribe to Noctivox Dark Stories, hit the notification bell, and tell me where you're listening from. Some histories were hidden for a reason, and some deserve to be heard.